Here's the highlight of some of the biggest stories we tracked for you over the course of this week. On the local front now, we start off with the biggest story of the season. The Monetary Policy Committee of the Central Bank of Nigeria has raised the monetary policy rate to 13% from an initial 11.5%, which had been the benchmark for quite a while now. It left other parameters unchanged. And now, within the telecommunications sector, the federal government has introduced a new telecommunication phone call tax. Now, there's been a whole lot of reactions trailing this move by the federal government. The aim, according to the government, is to ensure that we have the provision of health care for the vulnerable in the society. And now the Federal Inland Revenue Service also says that Nigeria's cautious approach to the endorsement of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, G20 Inclusive Framework, Pillar 2, solution to the taxation of the digital economy is in the best interest of the nation. And on the international front, Ukraine, which has been battered by 3 months of war, has now decided to continue plans to tap crypto investors to help raise funds after a plunge in prices decimated the country's fundraising efforts in the month of May. And now shifting focus to Germany now, the economy dodged a recession as in the first quarter we saw expectations also come to bear, looking at the economy bouncing despite the difficult economic conditions caused by the war in Ukraine and the pandemic. Europe's largest economy grew by 0.2% quarter-on-quarter and 3.8% on the year, adjusted for price and calendar effects, according to the Federal Statistics Office. And still on the international front now, Russian lawmakers have given the first stamp of approval to a bill that would allow Russian entities to take over foreign companies that have left the market in opposition to Moscow's action in Ukraine, the government's online data portal showed early on Tuesday. Well, it's about that time where we bring you some of the biggest stories we have from our correspondents. Here are the special packages.
The Nigerian Economic Summit Group's Economic Dialogue, a gathering that targets finding workable solutions to daunting economic challenges affecting the country.
If we make the right choices this year and next year, the country will move decisively towards structural and institutional reforms, which will unlock our local content potential.
First, how did we get here?
The thrust of discussions are critical economic areas needing speedy attention. They include weak and non-inclusive economic growth, macroeconomic instability, infrastructure deficit, skills gap, as well as weak economic competitiveness.
So to the extent that efforts can be put to diversify economic structures out of oil in the case of Nigeria to other domestic sectors that have comparative advantage, and here I go back to agriculture, I think that would increase the resilience of the Nigerian economy.
Nigeria is classified as the poverty capital of the world. Youth unemployment is high. People have spoken about inequality, but enough emphasis is not placed on this so-called inclusive growth and inequality.
The general consensus at the dialogue is that the country should expedite action in making the right choices that will vet short and long-term solutions to all of its economic setbacks. This also includes appropriate economic management efforts for better socio-economic outcomes.
Our politicians need to be accountable, provide jobs, provide education, provide health care, and all the necessaries that makes life abundant. They promised, after all, the dividends of democracy.
If we don't get the leadership right, persons with the courage, the capacity, and the ability to take the right decisions for the country, we will not get the economy right. If we don't get the economy right, issues of job creation, insecurity, safety, strength of institution will not be on the table.
The 2023 general election is gradually approaching, and identifying key structural issues as well as ways of addressing them is seen by the Nigerian Economic Summit Group as critical to the country making the right choices.
Now time to bring you the feature on the show today. We are looking at developmental agenda from the perspective of infrastructure development, the current deficit we have in Africa, and what is some of the efforts government is making to ensure that we have a correction of this narrative. But now, looking at the bigger conversation, we also have to tilt towards underground spaces and tunneling. Now, when you look at what some of the developments playing on the international front, this plays an integral role in the engineering of infrastructure development and solutions. Well, after this break, I would have a sit down with Abidemi Agwo. He is the Executive Council member of the International Association of Tunneling and Underground Spaces. Don't go anywhere. Thanks for still staying with us. It's now time to delve into the matter of the day as we look at underground space and tunneling and what are some of the missing elements here in Nigeria. How do we have fixes? There are no quick fixes really. And then in terms of futuristic thinking, especially for smart cities within the country along the West African front and then continental Africa, we just have to think big, think strategic. I have with me now Mr. Abidemi Agwo, who is also an Executive Council member of the International Tunneling and Underground Space Association. Thank you very much for joining me on the show today.
It's an absolute pleasure to be joining you here at TVC.
Now let's start off this conversation with what exactly is the missing link. Why don't we necessarily have underground space and tunneling play a major feature in terms of initiatives and infrastructure development plans and all of those? The conversation seems muted around this area.
So I would like to look at it from three perspectives. So there's the perspective of the awareness, I would say, as it is not just in Nigeria, but in many developing countries in the global south, to be precise. There's a lack of awareness, as in a lot of the professionals conventionally would look at development of cities from a superstructure point of view. And so, yeah, the awareness isn't quite there. Education as well. People are not well educated as to the benefits and the wide scope of application for which underground space use can be integrated into cities. And I would also like to link that as well to the lack of knowledge in terms of the social, the economic and environmental dynamics of how this interacts with the city as a whole. And lastly, capacity. Of course, you know, you would require quite a significant wide spectrum of capacity and enablement to be able to adopt and develop tunneling and underground space use.
Okay, now let's talk about solving some of these challenges that we have. We know that Nigeria houses one of the fastest growing cities we have across continental Africa. But we also have to bring this into perspective of how well we utilize our lands and spaces. This really tilts into the narrative of underground spacing and tunneling. You have to deal with waste disposal, you have to deal with the ease of movement and a whole lot more. How do we begin to work this narrative we have here on our hands?
Like they would normally say, from a developmental point of view, you would say development precedes accommodation. That is, you'd basically extensively develop before you begin to accommodate the area. And so looking at it from a standpoint of Nigeria and narrowing it down into Lagos, Lagos as a city with a population of over 20 million people and rapidly increasing every day from an urbanization point of view, is getting to a threshold point, as it were. And obviously, you know, the key challenges here are that the major utilities, the major service channels are stretched, you know, to their limits. And I'll give an example. You know, a few of the international projects I've been on. Currently, the United Kingdom, in London in particular, have just developed what you call the Thames Tideway Tunnel, which is the sewage tunnel, which was initially designed for 4 million people, but the population of London now is at 8 million. So it means the population has exceeded the capacity for the existing sewage infrastructure. But now we've built a new tunnel that will accommodate the population of London, just London, for the next 200 years. So that is forward thinking, you know, and that's basically what we need to start doing in Nigeria and also developing countries across the world. So we need to start, you know, looking at kind of have what you call like a strategic infrastructure master plan that incorporates elements of the development of the cities from the different demographics in terms of the population as well. So we need to basically start implementing a lot of these things, but giving ourselves the opportunity to explore how we can flexibly change the urban fabric of our cities by adopting tunneling and underground space use.
And also contextualizing these solutions, engineering solutions, fantastic ideas we have in terms of tunneling and underground spaces. It's quite simplistic to think that we can have engineering techniques copied and paste. We've seen some of these mistakes in some African cities, but to what extent now do you think we have to narrow down and make it work here within the country, especially looking at our geographical framework? We have to think home, think local, yet having that global perspective.
The biggest mistakes that countries and cities would make is to directly take ideas and implement them directly. And there's a lot to learn from. People ask me, do we not think we are well beyond the curve? I say no. As a matter of fact, we have an advantage. The advantage we have now is the benefit of foresight. We can leverage on lesson learned from countries like China, India. So China had a rapid pace of development, but then there are a lot of lessons learned in that. India as well. And because I'm part of the International Tunneling and Underground Space Association, I have access to all this information, and that is exactly what we're trying to do with the international body and working with professionals, working with students in the academia and here in developing countries and in Nigeria to educate ourselves first and foremost on the concept itself, and to look at how we can channel research opportunities that will enable us develop bespoke ideas and concepts that are relevant to the peculiar challenges our cities have. You know, the commonalities are floods, congestion, but then the solutions are local. So we think local, but with the adoption of international concepts. And it's all down to how much we're able to educate ourselves, how much we're able to build capacity, as well as how much we're able to also create this significant awareness that is required across board.
And then we have this fantastic conversation around the new faces of cities across the country. You hear of the likes of the new Lagos, but the new Lagos is really also fraught with challenges of floods. The rains are here, beautiful, fabulous houses are going to be flooded. We also have prospects that by the year 2050, we are even going to see increased flooding and much more. To what extent do you think we can correct the narrative with the existing structures we have in this new facelifts in the cities that we have today across the country?
Underground space is not as charismatic as the surface. You know, you look at the surface and you see the aesthetics, the beauty, you know, and everything. But then what we do is we need to, like you said, how do we create that narrative? All we need to do is just look out there at how these concepts have solved key problems. The perfect example for Lagos in terms of flood would be the Smart Tunnel in Malaysia. So Malaysia has a typical or a similar, in terms of environmental and also, you know, from an economic point, it's a developing country as well as Nigeria does. And they had a major problem, a challenge of flooding in Kuala Lumpur. And that problem, the challenge was just not the environmental part of it, but was also the economic part of it, because they had a lot of congestion as well in the city, just as we have in Lagos. And what they've done is they've basically looked at a solution that addressed faceted challenges. So it addressed both the environmental, which is the flood, as well as the economic part, which is congestion. Because time, they say, is money. You want to be able to get where you want to get to as soon as possible, and our ability to move people across the city, you know, is determines or shows the health of that city as well. So, if Lagos would look at some of these examples that have been integrated, applied in different parts of the country, a lot of people actually have what you call like outfall connections. So you have drains, you know, like channels that drain water from the city to, you know, the sea or the Atlantic Ocean or basically. So there are different ideas. I'm basically just, you know, suggesting that we need to sit down, you know, look at with the experts, the hydrogeologists, the engineers. Everyone needs to sit down, with their hearts all together on the table and begin to look at ways, thinking outside of the box, what we haven't thought of before, the non-conventional way, which is basically exploring the opportunities at the underground space. Underground space is not just for foundation, and it's not just for boreholes. There's a lot more to it.
Okay, now we also have to think of the prospects ahead. This is a heavy political season. The 2023 general election is just by the corner, and so many political actors are already talking quite interesting. But we've not had any talk about infrastructure development from the perspective of tunneling and utilizing underground spaces. This is somewhat of a novelty for us here. To what extent do you think we have to table this as part of the agenda which we require from government, especially within the part of we deserve better? Our roads are bad, there's heavy congestion, there's difficulty in our waste disposal systems. We're not just ticking the right buttons when it comes to infrastructure development. And we cannot just think of infrastructure development as just the simplistic, the bridges and the roundabout to see across board.
So infrastructure is the backbone of how a nation exists. It's like the skeleton, is the frame, and no serious government, would basically would exist without a framework or an agenda or a policy for infrastructure. And underground space use, for me, is a fundamental part of this. And that is basically a game changer in terms of what will take a city from just being a city to a mega city. The ability to flexibly, to be able to have that flexibility of mobility and infrastructure, to be able to meet the needs. And so looking at it, we basically need to start challenging ourselves. And one of the ways, that we've been able to, we're looking to do this, is also to create what you call like a kind of like a Think Deep initiative. And the Think Deep initiative is basically trying to get silos of a pool of ideas across cities, understanding the different problems, understanding the different challenges of the cities, and addressing those challenges by adopting underground space use. And we currently will be working with universities and working with students to be able to develop some of these ideas such that these ideas can form part of the infrastructure framework for government in the medium term. And that's basically what we're looking at, because what we lack is ideas and concepts that are relative to our problems and challenges in Nigeria. Once we have that, the politicians, the decision makers will be able to feed off that. The truth is, have we given them anything, to feed off? So we are basically working with universities. We're working, we've launched a Think Deep University campaign that would fill up that gap. But then the other thing is the decision makers, the politicians, would have to be audacious. They would have to be bold enough to say, this has worked in different parts of the world. We look at Abu Dhabi, we look at Singapore, we look at the United Kingdom. This can work for my people, and I would go all out to work with professionals in the country to see how this can be developed as well. So that's those are the different aspects and things we're looking at, and that the politicians can actually leverage on as a legacy, or something that they can basically attest to, that where they've basically brought on board an intervention that will be a game changer that can change the dynamics of the entire city.
Okay, now wrapping up our conversation, just before I let you go now, let's look at infrastructure deficit from the perspective of insecurity. That's one of the biggest challenges Nigeria has to face today. We cannot wave any magic wand and think, or wear any rose-colored glass thinking we're not going to face insecurity. But with states that are still relatively safer, how much of an incorporation do you think we also need to incorporate security details to our infrastructure development within the perspective of underground spaces and tunneling?
So, you're right. It's just, all of these elements come into play, when you're planning. So regions that are in seismic prone areas will develop infrastructure that are kind of like, that would be able to absorb, seismic activities. if there's a lot of insecurity, that would definitely need to come in as, you know, part of the decision making and elements of that. And those are the things we need to start looking at. You know, you're developing your private infrastructure. In a way, you might want to create a private bunker, you know. So a lot of these thoughts, needs to go into how, you know, we develop, you know, our infrastructure as well. So security, a lot of the infrastructure developed in developed countries right now is not just developed for the trains or the metro itself. You know, they serve. You look at the Ukraine, the underground served as an underground bunker, you know, for the citizens when it was being bombed by Russia. So it could serve a lot of purpose and at different times and functions, you know, at different times.
Thank you very much for your time on the show today. It's been an interesting conversation with you, Mr. Bidemi Agwande. We hope the government really takes seriously the concept, the scope, and the implementation of the strategies and efforts, engineering techniques when it comes to underground spaces and also tunneling. We just have to do better, and they would like to see this whole facelift that we have across the globe replicated here in the country. Thank you once again.
Thank you very much for having me. It's my pleasure.
And now, just before we go now, here are graphic details of the company's income tax for the first quarter of this year as prepared by the National Bureau of Statistics. And on that note, it's a wrap on this edition of Business Week. Many thanks for watching so far. Do make sure you enjoy your weekend. I'm David Alabi. Bye for now.